Welcome to Outta the Cage, a show that is here to bridge the gap between conventional thinking and comprehensive thinking. Join me, Roy Thompson, as I share with you my health journey from dis-ease to abundant life. Together, we will use that journey as a launch pad to see how hope and freedom are in store for you when you begin to see things differently, rather than what is common, ordinary, and comfortable. Real change can happen. It's time to break out of the cage. Welcome to Out of the Cage, episode 3. I'm so glad to be with you today. In the last podcasts, we talked about my health journey and how we kind of transitioned in our health. Today, I would like to talk to you about how we transitioned our operation, our farming operation, our ranch operation, to perhaps maybe a little more of a healthier model, one that suited our lifestyle a little better. I had mentioned in previous episodes how I really was growing things that I could not eat and that I couldn't feel good about growing. And I certainly was having to order in all of our food that we were having to eat as I transitioned my health. And so what I want to talk about today is how we transitioned to a point where I felt my passion and my purpose come back to farming and ranching, and how we started growing our own food, producing our own food, and then how we kind of turned that into a business. And we're still navigating that, to be totally honest with you. I'm not ever going to claim to have it all figured out. There's a lot more people that are doing it far better than I am, but it's a lot of fun to navigate and to implement things, whether it's diversity of livestock, diversity of different cover crops, sometimes maybe choosing not to go with a cash crop on certain acres and go with a diverse cover crop or biological primer mix that we can graze livestock on, or just strictly for pollinator mix, such as attracting bees and beneficial insects to the acres. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how that's looked as we've transitioned, some practical things we changed, why we changed, and that's what we're going to get into today. So I can't wait for this episode. It's a lot of fun to discuss. I love telling people about it, and I really am excited to tell you about it today. So as I talked about in previous episodes, in the last episode, I talked about our microbiome. I talked about bacteria and fungi and that symbiotic relationship that we have in our systems, in our guts, that helps us digest our food and keeps us healthy. We are largely bacteria and fungus. I mean, that sounds strange to say, but that's kind of what it's like in our gut. And as I started learning a little bit about soil health and learning about human health, Jordan Rubin would always say, all health begins in the soil. And I didn't really care too much about that phrase. I didn't get it. It didn't make sense to me. And I was just so focused on, when I realized we were going to be farming and ranching for our livelihood, I kind of just focused on doing it the way I was taught, and that meant several trips across your field with insecticide or herbicide or just any kind of pesticide. And it didn't matter exactly if there was just one little patch of the field or not, you've sprayed the whole thing. And that's kind of what I was taught, that anything that is growing that's not your cash crop, go out and kill it. And if you are having a problem with insects in your sunflowers or in your soybeans or whatever it might be, or grasshoppers, anything, go spray insecticide. And, that kind of made sense to me, because I was like, yeah, you want to get rid of the pests so that your cash crop can grow. But as I realized, the more and more that we went down the conventional path, I realized that wasn't really producing any life of any kind on our acres. It wasn't caring for soil health in any regard. And it took me a while to realize that I needed to get back to the fundamentals of soil health if I wanted to start seeing life and health return to our soils and make healthier plants and healthier animals and ultimately healthier people. I really needed to start learning about soil health. And it was at church one morning. I was visiting with a guy who was a visitor, and I thought I was just visiting, kind of making small talk, and I kind of learned that he was a farmer. He worked for a farmer. He wanted to transition more to a organic farm, and he was telling me what the hindrance or the problems, the issues with that could be, the hurdles he would have to jump through in order to do that, and what that would really look like long term to transition, the difficulties, the dangers, the challenges, I guess you'd say, that he was going to have to deal with in helping his boss transition their property. And so I was thinking about my own stuff, and I just asked him one time, I was like, is there anybody that ever just takes their farm ground and uses it to grow stuff for livestock? And not just for hay, because I'll get into this later, but if you take hay off your acres, you're removing all that carbon, you're removing all that armor off the soil surface. And so I'm thinking more so can I grow something that I can graze through with my animals that will improve soil health, and the cattle I can directly market to the consumer and things of that nature? And he said, well, have you ever heard of Gabe Brown? And I said, no, I hadn't. And so I got on YouTube, and I was like, oh man, there's hours and hours and hours of content here from Gabe Brown that I would really like to dive into and start learning about soil health. And I'd had this transition in my human health, in my body, and I was so discouraged early on because I was like, what do we do now? Do I sell our farm and ranch? Do I pick up and move somewhere? Do I start a health website? What do I do with this knowledge and this newfound conviction that I have to start, leading a healthier life? I can't keep growing things the way I was, and I thought that was the only way to grow them. Well, as I started learning about Gabe Brown, and then I found out about their company, Understanding Ag, and I learned about so many other people like Dave Brandt, Ray Archuleta, Rick Clark, Chris Nichols, Jonathan Lundgren, all these different people, many, many others, by the way, but that I could really start fresh with a new understanding of what agriculture should look like as far as in my heart and in my life and how I feel our operation should be run. And so as I continue going down that path, it was like when I was learning about health and nutrition, there was so much I wanted to, it was like I was drinking from a fire hose. It was just so much info, but I just felt like a sponge. I just wanted to keep it going in. And I felt like the retention I felt like God opened my mind to actually retain what I was hearing so that I could implement it in a relatively short manner. And that's kind of what it was like when I started going down the regenerative path. Because one of the first things I heard Gabe say, he said, I don't like the term sustainable agriculture. And I was like, wait a second, why not? That's something that makes sense to me. And he was like, because I don't want to just sustain a degraded resource, meaning your soil. And I was like, well, that's interesting. I mean, he's in regenerative agriculture, so he said, we want to regenerate the soil. So essentially he's saying we just don't want to have good, sustainable agriculture that, you know what, he said even his ground has some degradation to it because of all the years of whether it's tillage or chemicals or whatever. As you start transitioning, you're starting with a degraded resource. So we want to keep regenerating that soil. And so that really made sense to me. I was like, wow, regenerative agriculture, that's a really interesting word. So I was like, what is that? And so in this episode, I hope I can kind of explain the steps we went through, why regenerative agriculture is so important, and the benefits of it, whether it's financial reasons, because you can really cut inputs and you start regenerating the soil. All of a sudden, you don't need all the synthetic amendments. Whether you're thinking about it from an environmental standpoint, what's good for the environment, air quality, water quality. A lot of people like talking regenerative agriculture for climate change reasons, and that's just fine too. I'm coming at it from more of a health standpoint, but it really does address so many of those topics. So soil degradation, when all health begins in the soil, we need to kind of understand what conventional model actually is and why regenerative agriculture is different. So farmers get paid for quantity, not necessarily quality of their product. They get paid for bushels and pounds of whatever they're taking off their land. Whether that's cattle, they're getting paid by weight. Whether that's, so with the cattle side of things, people will say, well, let's give this artificial growth hormone when they're calf, so as they grow, they can put on much more weight. And then once they're weaned off their mom, let's give them another implant, another hormone to really help them gain weight in the feedlot. And so there's a lot of that. That's just common practice. And we did it too. I'm not down on anybody that does that. I'm just simply saying I, in my heart, feel convicted to change that part of our operation. So we've cut out all artificial growth hormones. But farmers and ranchers are paid on pounds and bushels. So the more bushels you can grow, the more you get paid. The more pounds an animal weighs, the more you get paid. And a desire I have, and it's so exciting because I see things starting to take place where they can be raised in a regenerative way and actually get paid for quality rather than quantity. So if the nutrient density of the crop you're growing is higher, you get paid more. If you're sequestering more carbon, or if your soil health practices are, right in line with a regenerative model, like there's a regulation coming out, a label coming out, I guess you'd say, called Regenerative. Understanding Ag has been working on it, and that is going to be a really, really good label to have, because there's going to be different tiers of that label. So if you're just say, for instance, tier 1, that means you might incorporate some organic practices and regenerative practices like cover crops or cattle integration or whatever. There's going to be a lot. And then the second tier, you might still do some conventional, but you do some soil health practices, and you may get paid according to how deep into the regenerative model you are, how many regenerative practices you implement. And that's really exciting, because farmers and ranchers will begin to get paid for the quality rather than just quantity. And so that's a move in the right direction. But in the conventional model, the soil is treated for the desired purpose. Minerals and other nutrients are mined from the soil without being replaced. The high amounts of synthetic fertilizers are used in high amounts to grow the next crop. So you might grow a legume one year like soybeans that's fixing its own nitrogen, so you don't have to put nitrogen down, but people might put phosphorus with it, or they might put sulfur with it, or whatever. They may put stuff down with it, but you wouldn't have to. Soybean kind of grows on its own, but it usually is a treated seed, and usually you have to spray it 2 to 3 times. Maybe sometimes even more, depending on insect pressure and things like that. Also, fungicides. It's harmful in the way that they disrupt and kill most of the relationship between plants and the fungal communities below the soil surface. Those would typically be used to transfer the nutrients to the plant as well as water absorption, while the plants provide the fungus with carbohydrates formed with photosynthesis. Insecticides knock the entire ecosystem out of balance by killing the beneficial and predatory insects. Out of nearly 1 million known insects, only 2% are actually considered a pest. Herbicides can be harmful in the way that in biology, herbicides can be harmful to soil biology in the way that they can chelate and bind up nutrients, killing off the microbes, fungus, and bacteria. Synthetic amendments in the soil are much like antibiotics and steroids to us in the human body. So with fungicides, insecticides, herbicides, those are really killing the biology of the soil. And you will notice too, and I said this in previous episode, I believe, but if you are walking through a monoculture field, you might see an insect here and there, or hear one here and there. When you walk through a diverse cover crop mix that has multiple species of plants planted all at once in the same row, all of a sudden you see so much life. You hear it, you see bugs, ladybugs, caterpillars, beetles, dragonflies, bees, all these things return into the soil. You see pheasants flying out, coyotes in those fields, deer running through there, especially in the winter. You see so much life on those acres. And when you walk through a monoculture field, it's just dead silent. And the occasional fly, you hear something like that. But when I seen that life return in a cover crop system, I was just blown away. That is what I was like. I was just like, this is what we need to be doing. And so we did. We started cutting out some of these synthetic amendments to be used in such heavy amounts. The problem is you got to really transition it. You got to slow it down. You can't just cut off all synthetics all at once. It's kind of like if you imagine your soil as being more like an addict, like a drug addict. You can't just cut it off all at once, or you will have some serious problems because that soil is addicted to the synthetics, to the high amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus. The weeds and the suppressed weeds are getting so many trips of chemical and herbicide and things, it's going to take a while to back off on those things. I heard last winter, conference I was at, they were saying you have to earn the right to reduce inputs. And that really made sense to me, because you got to work with your soil and start transitioning off of those things rather than just cutting them off cold turkey. So in a conventional model, carbon is always removed from monoculture crops. Nothing is being done to heal the soil. So you're always taking something off, whether it's a wheat berry, whether it's soybeans or corn, you're taking carbon off, especially in like a silage where you're taking the entire corn stalk off, you're chopping it up, and it's usually used for animal feed. You're just left with nothing. You're left with about 6 inches of corn stalk stubble and usually bare dirt in between. So there's nothing regenerating that soil. NPK fertilizers may aid in helping grow the plant large and it looks like it's thriving. But as Dr. Christine Jones says, that plant is nothing but an empty vessel. When you're putting certain nutrients that plant needs to grow big and tall, it's really not corresponding with the biology under the soil to create a lot of plant nutrients, you might say, in that plant. It's just kind of an empty vessel, as she would say. Find a smaller plant growing, in healthy, thriving soil and an ecosystem, and that produce will be substantially higher in bionutrients. Animals consuming these plants have a much higher nutrient profile, including higher amounts of CLA, antioxidants, vitamins, and far more balanced fatty acid profile in their meat, milk, and fat than conventionally finished animals. When animals are raised and finished in a healthy ecosystem, there's almost no need for any insecticide porons or antibiotics. Grass-fed and grass-finished animals are rarely ever given any implanted hormones or ever treated with any synthetic treatment. But it's best to know your farmer and rancher so that you know for sure. These are some of the notes I've put into a speech that I give. Sometimes I'm asked to speak at certain events and conventions and things. So that's what I'm reading off of. I'm reading off of my PowerPoint presentation there. So that's kind of the conventional model. It's to grow as much per acre as possible. That's really what it is, whether that's livestock or grains. And I'm not saying all people that follow a conventional model are trying to rape the soil, but oftentimes that's what happens, whether they know it or not. And I'm still transitioning out of that conventional model, and I'm still pursuing regenerative agriculture. And as we are able to alleviate more of our debt, we will continue to move in that direction more and more. And regenerative agriculture offers you, it asks the question, what is more profitable rather than what will make you more bushels? So are you willing to put the amount of synthetic amendments out there for 300 bushel corn per acre? Or are you willing to, work with your soil health and maybe expect 130 bushel corn, but have far less dollars into that acre? And that's kind of what regenerative agriculture asks. Let's work with nature rather than against it. And so rather than just going out to kill an insect or kill a bug or even a weed, how can we kind of work with it to adjust our operation so that we're not killing all that, but we're advancing life in the ecosystem? And that's when the light bulb really came on for me, because I wasn't growing or raising anything I could eat. Like I said earlier, I had lost so much of a desire for the way I'd been farming because I had this radical health transformation. And then I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this? I'm buying all my food from ranchers and farmers who are doing this differently. How could I do things differently? So as I got to learning more and more about Gabe Brown, at that same time, I started taking part in what was called the NRCS, which is Natural Resource Conservation Service, the bee program. It's a pollinator mix. It's a season-long cover crop mix. You plant about 7 to 11 different plants and species. For me, this year, I believe we have radish, turnip, cowpeas, buckwheat, sun hemp, millet, sorghum, what else? Red clover, flax. Trying to think. Anyway, there's tons of them. There's rapeseed out there. There's another one out there too. Trying to think. Anyway, lots of different diverse mixes out there. and they blossom and bloom at different times. Oh, mustard is the other one. And so they bloom at different times, and the bees will come in and they'll be pollinating, and you go out and you check this cover crop about every 2 weeks. You count how many bees you're seeing at these different spots in the field. And every 20 acres, you're checking the bees, you're counting them, you're checking to see what's pollinating, what's not, and what's growing well. And that is when I just realized, man, we've got to start doing things different. There's no synthetic amendments. There's no fertilizer put down. It was cheap to grow. The seed was like $20 an acre. And that was so much cheaper than growing corn, which is about, for seed alone is about $80 an acre. So it really made sense to me. It's something we could graze after a freeze with our cattle. So we go in there and the cattle just love it, and they do very well on it. And then you have all that residue on top of the soil after you are able to graze through it. And so that's what kind of put the light bulbs on for me when I was thinking about all these things I could possibly do different. And as I started seeing that this cover crop was doing so well without any dollars put to it as far as synthetic amendments, I just plant it. I watch it throughout the year. I see all the life return. We graze through it with cattle. The cattle do well on it. The soil health improves. And then since it was a NRCS program, I did get paid a couple $100 an acre to do that. And so it was profitable for me, and that was something that I needed as well financially. So as I was farming conventionally, we had several years in 2016 through 2019 seemed like we lost money in 2016 substantially. We lost a lot of money in 2016. In 2017, we lost more. 2018, we were slightly profitable. And then the following year, 2019, we lost some money again. And then that's when we really started implementing the regenerative practices. We started getting more rain, which really helped. And that is when our financial balance sheet started improving as well. And it has been a work in progress. It's a lot better now. I used to call it the hellhole of debt when I talked to Meredith about it. We were $430,000 in our operating debt alone, without a lot of stuff to sell to make up for that. So that operating loan was something we had borrowed from the bank to get all our crops in, get all our cattle where they need to go, to pay rent and all those input costs. But yet what we were going to have to sell our crops for wasn't going to pay off that note. So we had to roll that into the next year and then the next year. And it just took so long to kind of get out of that hole. And as we started to heal our soils and be able to back off of some of those input costs, that made a substantial change in our operation. And that's when I started learning about the 6 tenets of soil health. Number 1 is limit soil disturbance. So tillage, try to limit any amount of tillage as much as you can so you don't break up that fungal component and that bacteria underneath the soil surface. Armor on the soil surface, you want to make sure you have a nice bed of residue so that it protects the soil, so that if you get heavy driving rain, it's not eroding the soil. It hits that residue, and it doesn't just make a puddle of water, but it actually soaks in. It hits that armor and then soaks into the soil. You want to build diversity. That means whether it's plants you're growing, you want to build the diversity under the soil as well, such as your microbiome of the plants. So that'd be what Dr. Christine Jones calls the rhizosheath, or the sociobiome of plants and the interaction they have with the biology under the soil. So you put in a lot of multi-species cover crop mixes. And you do that as soon as you take your cash crop off, and then you can graze it. You can put cover crop in, multiple species growing all at once, and combine it as a mix, like oats and peas or rapeseed and peas. You could do it with like millet and buckwheat, things you can grow together that you don't have to, you just separate with a seed cleaner at the end of the year and sell 2 crops rather than 1. That's a good way of implementing diversity, but also livestock diversity on whatever you're grazing. When you're able to graze on these acres, you go ahead and you bring in cattle, and then maybe chickens, and then maybe sheep and goats, or whatever you have. You can implement that livestock integration, which is the 5th tenet of soil health. And also keeping a living root in the soil at all times. Soil can heal so rapidly with a living root. So you want that photosynthesis coming in, you want carbon sequestration, and that's all happening when you see a green plant alive in the soil. That is sequestering carbon, that is transferring nutrients into the soil, and that's helping that nutrient cycle begin again from what was once degraded, and it's pulling in all this good stuff and putting it under the soil. So you want a living root as long as possible. That's why as soon as we take a cash crop off now, we'll go in and we'll plant a multi-species cover crop mix so that there's something living in there, even in the fall. And then we'll graze it in the fall, and it'll come back in the spring, such as cereal rye, hairy vetch, winter wheat, what else? Triticale, some things like that that'll come back. Certain areas can do a certain pea that'll come back in the spring, but we get too cold up here, peas will winter kill. So those are some things that we can grow in the fall that we can then graze, and then it'll come back on its own in the spring, and then we can either combine or graze in the spring. Or some people can utilize as a hay crop as well. Like I said, number 5, fifth tenet of soil health is integrating livestock. And then number 6 is context. And that's really saying whatever works for me in South Dakota might not work for somebody down in the South. Or whatever works for someone like Rick Clark in Indiana, who does several thousand acres, 6,000 to 7,000 acres of regenerative organic no-till. Might not work for us up here as much because he gets far more rainfall. But certain principles can still work no matter where you're at. And so you just need to decide what your context is, whether you're in Mexico or whether you're in Canada or wherever you're at. It's going to look differently to incorporate these 6 tenets of soil health. But just understanding what your context is. And for you, if you're listening and you live in a city, you're maybe you're a stay-at-home mom, or maybe you have a job and you're running all the time. How can you incorporate regenerative agriculture in your life? It really comes back to either knowing your farmer or rancher, get to know them and how they're raising your food, or starting to buy organic and buy regenerative, even better, to buy regenerative. And you will start seeing more and more things claiming regenerative practices on their label. But we really want to make sure that we know where that food is coming from, how it was grown, because unfortunately we have a way of whitewashing labels. You know, you can say grass-fed beef, but is it really grass-fed? Is it grass-finished? Because it might be grass-fed its whole life, but then the last 2 months of its life gotten a bunch of corn in its diet to, improve finishing weight, maybe flavor, maybe marbling. And so you want to make sure you're buying grass-fed, grass-finished. But we all love labels, don't we? We like labeling everything. I mean, I remember I did an interview with a gentleman that you'll see in later episodes, but Lance Gunderson, and he said he's seen a water bottle that had all these claims on its label of what all it was. It's like it's water. It's H2O. And it's just funny to see how the marketers have figured out that we as people like labels. And so you want to make sure when you're buying, you understand what you're buying. Are you just buying marketing, or are you actually buying a great product that was raised the way you want it to be? And the best way to know you are is by knowing your farmer and rancher. And I just encourage people to learn where their food has come from and get to interact with people that you're buying it from. Have that community aspect. And if you're buying food from a farmer or rancher that won't let you come see how it was grown, you might want to find a new farmer or rancher, because integrity should be the number one thing that people are selling. And that is allowing you to come and see the plants that are growing that you're buying, or the beef or the dairy or whatever, and kind of build that relationship. And I really hope we can get back to more of a relying on each other in the community, and not always just buying from the big box stores. And I do too at times. I buy from big companies from time to time as well. But as much as we can, especially with our food, let's start learning where it comes from, how it was raised, and make sure that that trust is built with you and your producer. So for you, that's your context. It's, maybe you can't raise a garden. Maybe you can't farm or ranch. Maybe you can't raise your own livestock. You can seek out those that are growing it and build that relationship. And I guarantee some people say, well, I don't have the money to buy regenerative. I don't have the money to buy organic. You know what? That's probably true if you're going to the grocery store for it. But if you find a farmer or rancher, or gardener, I guarantee you're going to be able to get a very competitive price because the producer is capturing so much more of that food dollar than what they do when they just take it to market. I believe I said in the last episode, I think it's about 8 to 13% that the producer actually gets at the end of the day when they just take their products and sell wholesale or just sell, to the market. And then a company takes their products, whether it's grain or beef or whatever, and they package it and they sell it to these big grocery stores, and then people go and buy it from the grocery store. I believe it's about 8 to 13% that the producer's actually getting. By the time that dollar is spent on the product that came from the farmer, they're getting about 13% of that dollar. Now, if you go directly to the producer, then they can capitalize on 80 to 90% of that food dollar. And so that's something that they're able to offer a better price if they're getting more profit at the end of the day. And so that's what I hope we can start seeing more and more of as well. So our operation has changed drastically. Like I say, we are transitioning. It has been a slower transition. I have the personality where I would just love to drop all synthetics all at once. That makes sense to me. Let's go with all these cover crops. I just want change, and I want it now, and I want to become more profitable. I want to sell our entire beef herd to grass-fed, direct marketed business, all this, consumers, all this stuff I want right away. But like I said before, it's a transition. It takes a little while to build a market. It takes a little bit to heal your soil so you can cut back on inputs and become more profitable. So it does take a little while. But our operation changed by beginning to sell directly some grass-fed, grass-finished beef. I said I was having to buy mine. Well, I started raising it, and I told my wife, I said, well, I wish we could do this as a business. And she said, well, I don't really want to do that until I know for sure that what we are raising is something I would buy. And I said, well, fair enough. Meredith has always had very keen senses, whether it was smell, taste, touch, whatever it is. She was, especially smell and taste, very keen. Or hearing. I mean, she hears things that I'm like, nope, I don't hear that. She's, what is that? Like, I have no idea. I don't hear it. Or do you smell that? No, I don't. And so she's got very keen senses. So what I thought was great beef that we were raising, she was the one I needed to convince. So we started raising our beef. And in the early spring, whatever grains up first, we get our grass finishers on. And so they go right from being fed bales of grass hay or alfalfa straight to whatever's green first, and then they start grazing. And all year long, they'll graze native pasture in the spring, and then as soon as that cover crop comes up, it's usually cereal rye that comes up first. We get them over onto our rye fields, and they graze some of the rye. And as that rye gets too mature, then we move them off, and we put them back on native pasture, and we plant our warm season mix, usually a sedan grass or a millet with lots of mix in there. I could have it up, but things like mung beans, chicory, plantain, oats, peas, barley, just a lot of things like that. Sometimes it's a sedan and a millet mix, pearl millet, and sometimes it has more things. I oftentimes put a flowering plant in that cows usually don't eat much of, like flax or buckwheat, just to keep that diversity up there and keep insects coming. And then we'll graze through that with our grass finishers. And then as soon as that's gone, then we move on to the cover crop that we planted after a spring crop. So like say we take oats or rye off with the combine, then we go in there and we plant a multi-species mix. And usually in the fall, that's probably a couple inches tall or maybe even up to 6 inches tall. And we go in there and we graze that until wintertime, as long as we can into the winter. And once it's snowed under or they're done grazing, then we bring them back in and start feeding them grass hay and alfalfa as well. So we started selling that grass-fed beef when Meredith said, yes, I'm happy with this. A lot of grass-fed beef gets a bad rap because it's maybe gamey or wild or tough or leathery, people say, or whatever. That's usually due to their diet. Was their diet diverse, or were they just on one plant species out in that pasture, maybe a handful of plant species, or did they have a drought that year and they were just eating sticks and weeds and different things like that? Or did they have a good diverse diet? When we finish on cover crop, we do that in order to improve. The cattle do very well on it, and they gain weight quickly, and it's usually intramuscular fat, so it's the marbling, and that really preserves a good flavor in the meat. And a lot of times people are like, well, we'll have to prepare this grass-fed beef differently. I'm like, no, you really don't, because the way we finish them, it still can be fatty. It's leaner, but yet the fat is healthy. We never drain off grease off of our burger anymore. We just eat all the fat that comes with our beef. So we started selling that grass-fed beef after Meredith said, okay, I would buy this. I'm ready. I can agree. We can start selling it. And so then we did. And we're still at the small scale. We're coming through about 3.5 years of drought now. And it's really tough to finish grass-fed animals when it's a really dry climate and really dry season. And so we had to back our number back. So we're still starting on a small scale. We have plans to increase our direct marketed herd this year, actually. So in 2024, I hope that we are selling to some restaurants as well as all of our customers, and hopefully increase our customer base as well. We do ship, so little plug in there for Triple T brand. But we are currently sold out at the moment, but this fall we should be fully stocked by October. We started selling niche grains such as cereal rye, and now there's a company that buys rye and hairy vetch together. So hairy vetch overwinters, it's a legume that overwinters. So we plant that in the fall. We can graze it in the fall. In the spring, it's very hardy and it grows fast. We can graze it lightly in the spring and then still combine it midsummer. Also, I've started growing a non-GMO corn, and I would really like to grow an open pollinated corn if I can learn to grow it organically, if at all possible. And I'm working towards that. I'm practicing with a few acres each year, and I've learned a lot. But there again, with the last few years of drought, it's really hard to raise no-till organic corn. And that's what I'm working towards. But I really want to increase the niche market in grain. We raised and then combined a cover crop mix, and I use that for chicken feed. So I've sold some chicken feed to some neighbors, and I haven't advertised it or anything, but I would like to sell chicken feed. Those are some of the things that we've done to start incorporating more of a niche crop that we can directly market rather than just selling to the open market, to the global market, I should say. Diverse rotation. Now we don't just grow corn, wheat, and soybeans. We do still grow some corn, but it's a non-GMO, non-treated corn that we grow. It's $50 an acre for the seed versus $80. So that's why I started going down that route in the first place. It's because it was a lot cheaper. We were a lot more profitable. And every year I've had it, it's beat out my conventionally raised corn, that GMO corn. And so this year was the first year we went 100% non-treated, non-GMO corn. I would eventually like to grow that open pollinated corn, like I said, but your yield is a lot less than it is with non-GMO corn that's been hybridized. And I would like to grow it to mix in with our chicken feed, so that's my hope. This year I didn't have any open pollinated. It's tough for me to find a shorter day open pollinated variety, so I'm going to try that for next year. Also, what we're moving towards is not doing as many cash grains, but really working towards doing more of multi-species mix and then grazing it with diverse herds of animals. So we'll go through with our grass finishers. We'll go through with hopefully some sheep sometime, and then we'd really like to grow a larger chicken herd. I think flock, I guess is what you call it, and do more eggs and meat birds and things of that nature. Regenerative agriculture offers you so many opportunities. You're really only limited by your imagination. I've heard stories about people raising a garden on 20 acres, a large garden, and doing a market garden. And they've made their living doing regenerative agriculture on 20 acres or 10 acres. I've heard it with even less. I've heard of people that have only had a few acres and they've done chickens, a garden, and then they harvest certain like heirloom seeds and sell seeds. They've harvested stuff like niche grains and turned it into flours and then breads and things like that, such like einkorn or kamut or things like that. I just think there's so many opportunities. You can start with If you buy a chicken and you start raising eggs and then selling those eggs and then you grow your flock that way. There's so many things you can incorporate in stacking enterprises that really goes well with regenerative agriculture, because you can regenerate your balance sheet while you're regenerating the soil, while you're regenerating health and life back into the ecosystem. So also, sorry, I know I get off base when I'm going through things we've changed. I just go on a rant, and I just get to enjoying talking about the things we've changed, why we changed them, and what we've seen as part of what we've seen as a result, I guess you would say. So we limit any residual chemicals, so we really don't use any atrazine anymore. We don't use any Spartan herbicide on sunflowers. We don't use any of those chemicals that have high residuals. Anything we're growing for feed, such as our grass-finished beef, never gets sprayed. Any plants that are being grazed never get sprayed. And any hay that we grow, we don't want to spray. This year I did have to spray one field that I was planning on grazing, but I had to spray it, and therefore I'm going to use that as a cash crop instead, so that the animals aren't eating anything that had herbicide sprayed on it. So we utilize what's called the Haney soil test, and that has been a game changer for us, because the Haney soil test credits you for organic nutrients that are already in the soil. If an elevator comes out and takes soil samples, it only credits you for the inorganic forms of nutrients that are there. But the Haney soil tests goes through a lot of different processes to extract all the nutrients, organic and inorganic nutrients. And then it lets you know what you can cut back on fertility without sacrificing yield. So if you put your yield goal in on the form that you send into Regen Ag Labs or Ward Labs or wherever you send it, it really will tell you, you know what, if you want this many bushel corn, you're going to need this many pounds of nitrogen. And then you can decide, okay, well, you know what, I'm not going to try for that. I'm just going to not put any fertilizer down, and I can expect this yield or that yield. Or if I put down just a little bit of 28%, in furrow or off to the side or whatever, when we plant, that's going to give me this yield. So it really has helped us cut back on fertility without sacrificing yield. I have cut out all phosphorus fertilizers other than a small amount that I put in with our corn in furrow. And I used to put down 120 pounds of mez, which is a mix. It's a mix of phosphorus and different nutrients every year. And I was just blown away that I needed to put that amount of money in per acre every year on these crops. And it always called for it. Well, when I started doing the Haney soil test, it didn't recommend any phosphorus. So I cut that out. And I've just figured the last, I would say, 4 years that I haven't applied phosphorus, I've saved over $100,000 just on our small operation. So it's a substantial savings. And that's been something that has been a huge blessing to use that Haney soil test. So we've, like I've talked about, farming for our cattle, doing what we call a regen year, where we grow a multi-species mix. We graze through it with our cattle, pull the cattle off, plant a warm season mix, and then about this time of year, which is September, we can go in and graze that warm season mix. The Sudan, if you have enough moisture, it'll get to be 8 feet tall, even taller sometimes. And the cattle, you can't even see them when they go in there, and they just start grazing, and they knock it down. It gives you a nice bed of residue and good armor on the soil surface, and the cattle do extremely well on it. So that's something we're also wanting to incorporate more and more of. I also cut out all seed treatments. I will say, I'll be 100% honest with you, this year when I planted soybeans, which I only plant once every 4 years or so, I planted and I was going with all untreated. It's called planting a naked seed. I didn't do any treatment. I just inoculated it with some bacteria, and it's called, I think it's rhizobia. I don't know what the inoculant was, but it wasn't a treatment. It wasn't a herbicide or an insecticide treatment. It wasn't a neonic. And I started planting, and I realized I had on that same field a couple years before, I'd had a disaster. I planted a quarter of corn, all non-treated, and I just thought I was ready. I tried non-treated, non-GMO seed on 40 acres the first year. It did great. The next year I did 80 acres. It did great. So the third year I did a whole quarter, 160 acres, and I planted it. And I went back to see if there were any weeds coming about a month later. I planted on the 11th of May, and I went back on the 1st of June, and I couldn't even row it. It was awful. What I planted at 24,000 population, so 24,000 seeds per acre, I couldn't even count. There wasn't even 8,000 seeds per acre. I couldn't row it. It was just a sporadic plant here and there. And what I'd learned was that I hadn't earned the right to cut back on inputs on that field. So I would dig down and I would see a wire worm, and I would see they'd get in a trench, and those worms went right up the seed trench, burrowing a hole in every seed. Or the seed would come up, and then all of a sudden the sprout would just tip over, and I'd pull it out, and there's cutworms. So there was just, the ecosystem was out of balance. I called Gabe Brown. I said, Gabe, what's up? I said, I've tried out this seed. It's good seed. It all sprouted. I see it germinated well. But what was it? He said, well, did you ever apply insecticide? I said, yeah, I did the year before. We had sunflowers down here, and I had to do insecticide because we were having so much harmful insects in our seed head. He said, yep, that. And did you have treated seed? I said, yep. And he said, have you ever done any regenerative practices on that ground? I said, no, not yet. This was my first attempt. He said, yep, the ecosystem was so knocked, the soil, the biology was so out of balance that when you sprayed that insecticide, when you planted those treated seeds, it killed all the good bugs with the bad ones. And then the harmful ones were the ones that prevailed. And then now you have more harmful than good. And you need to take some years to really regenerate that ecosystem and that biology in that soil. So I said, okay, that makes sense. And I called the seed company. I told them what happened. Thankfully, they covered a lot of the replant. We replanted it, and the Lord really took care of me because that year we were dry in the spring. We had moisture in the fall, and my corn was young enough because it was planted late enough to where it utilized all that moisture. And I was so thankful. I had much better yield on the replanted stuff than I had on my other corn that was not needing to be replanted in other fields. So it worked out that year. But when I was planting my beans down there this year, I thought, I had cover crop last year. I did the bee program. We grazed it. We'd taken a couple years to try to really hone in on some soil health. I don't know. I wonder if I can get by with planted untreated soybeans. And so Gabe said, yeah, I called him. I said, do you think I should try it? Should I go with all untreated beans? He said, well, you already planted 70 acres of the field untreated. How about you treat the rest and just see how it worked? So I did. So half of that field did get soybean treatment. Otherwise, everything else was bare seed. And there was a little bit of a stand loss on those first 70 acres than there was on the second half. But I don't even notice it. We're going to combine here in probably 3 weeks, and I'll know at that point if the yields were any different between the untreated or the treated. But by and large, we have completely marked off, other than that field, we've marked off seed treatments. And insecticides we no longer use. Instead of insecticides on our sunflowers, we plant every 150 feet, we plant a pollinator strip, and that's a season-long cover crop mix where it attracts beneficial insects. And then the thought and the principle behind it is we track the beneficials, and they eat the harmful ones and keep the harmful ones in check. And that worked really well the year we did it. This year we didn't have any sunflowers, so we didn't need to do that this year either. But then those pollinator strips, there are a lot of gourds and pumpkins and things like that flower season long. And what I noticed is the deer come in there in the wintertime. And I tell you, our fields where we had sunflowers last year was like an ant pile. There were hundreds of deer out on those pollinator strips all winter long, eating the gourds, eating the pumpkins. And so that was a great way of diversifying, livestock on those acres as well. I just had to be really careful when I planted it this year that the deer sheds didn't poke holes in my tires. And we picked up as many as we could find, but I still picked up 2 in my sprayer tire when I did have to spray. So, but that was okay. I'd rather have the livestock integration. So that is really what we've changed. One thing we're adding in is biologicals. We're starting to incorporate. We haven't yet. I'm making them this fall. I'm going to have some help, and we're going to make some bioreactors. If you're interested, look up Johnson Sioux bioreactors. It's essentially making a compost and then extracting a tea, if you will, or a compost extract from that and treating your seed with it in the spring. I can also put it through the sprayer and spray biologicals on my plants. I've seen a lot of data that has shown increased in plant health, and it's going to be another step in really helping us cut back on synthetics. And it's really going to up the, what would you say, probably the fungal component in your soil. And that's going to be really exciting to see too. It's not going to be so bacteria dominated. It's going to have some fungal component to it as well. And that's going to really aid us in backing away from more synthetics. So as we continue to move down this path, we're going to expand. We do have a regenerative vegetable garden. It's no-till, completely organic vegetable garden. And that is something that we've been really excited about. I think this is our 5th year doing it, and we've had hail about every other year. So we're going to invest in some netting so that we can take the netting off. And if there's a storm coming, we're going to put the netting on so that we don't get just destroyed from the hail like we did this year and years before. So, but what was so interesting, I did what was called a PLFA test, and it's essentially a scorecard for your soil. And I did it right inside our garden, and then truly 2 feet away, right across the fence where we haven't had any regenerative practices. And I took one there, I soil probed it there, and the results were astonishing. I had a score of, I can't even remember the number right now. I could put the details up maybe in the show notes, but the PLFA test showed such a higher score in the garden than it did right outside, just 2 feet away. So regenerative agriculture works to heal the soil. It is something that I'm completely sold on, but it does take a bit of I think people say within 3 years you can see a dynamic change in your soil, and I would agree with that. 5 years is even better. And livestock integration for our garden, we usually turn our chickens in the fall. We have also turned a couple horses in there. We've turned bottle calves in there, and that's what we usually put in there in the spring or in the fall to kind of just get a little bit of animal integration to that little veggie garden too. I would like to see our garden expand and maybe even do a bit of a market garden at some point. So my wife loves flowers. So that's a great place where she grows them around the edge. We had honeybees this year that we've also incorporated. We bought enough equipment for 8 hives. So we're starting small, and they drew the comb this year. They did a great job. We're going to extract the honey this week. So we're going to be able to sell honey on our website as well. And so grass-fed beef, regeneratively raised honey, I guess you'd say. And those are the things that we're incorporating. We're eventually thinking about sheep and chickens as well. We do have chickens now, but it's just for ourselves. And then dairy, we're probably not going to do that at a large scale. My wife grew up on a dairy. She has no desire to go back to having a dairy, but I would love it, sometime if we have somebody interested in raising or in running a bit of a dairy, then we could hire. I would definitely sell dairy as well. A2 regeneratively processed milk and cheese and butter. That would be awesome. That's a dream for the future. But those are the things we've changed, and we have seen so much life come back to the ecosystem and the acres that we farm and ranch. We do still have to use chemical here and there, but never for anything, like I said, that we graze or anything that we ever consume ever gets sprayed at all. It's usually in the off season that we have to spray it if we're doing a cash crop. Sometimes that needs a trip of chemical, and we're trying to back away from that as well. And it looks very, very promising. Any rye that we grow has never had to be sprayed. And if we can do rye 1 year and the next year we graze the volunteer and knock it all down, maybe even use a roller crimper instead of herbicide to terminate it, and then go in with a warm season mix, we have a plan of getting to the point where we can be regenerative organic, but it is a transition and we're not quite there yet. But the plan and the dream is there. So that's what I'm excited about. I hope that helps you understand kind of how we've regenerated our soils, how we are continually regenerating our soils, because I don't think you ever quite get there, but we want to see our organic matter continue to increase, and we want to see our inputs back away. And eventually, I'd like everything we raise to be directly marketed to the consumer that is healthy, and we can show those health benefits of our beef and of the plants we grow through testing and through data as well. And that's the direction we're moving toward. So those are some things we've changed. And maybe I'll put up some pictures in this show as well that you can see I'm still new to this. So as we go through this podcast, if you're watching it on YouTube, hopefully we have some pictures for you to see in there, and that kind of helps you understand what we're working towards. So that's kind of where we're at in our life right now and in our operation. We have seen our balance sheet improve dramatically. We have seen we're still not completely out of debt. That is a desire. That's something we're working towards. And as we continue to go down the direct marketing path and a niche crop path and backing away on inputs, I only see that getting better and better. And so I'd like to leave you with a question. What is your context? Whether it's from the food you eat to the plants you grow, maybe you're a farmer or rancher as well. Where are you at right now? Let's start with the health side of things. Start with what you consume the most, whether it's the water you drink, the protein you eat, if you eat a lot of grains like through bread or whatever, or if you eat a lot of veggies or dairy, whatever it is, make that the healthiest choice and start there. Start making your change with one thing, like I said, we started with the water, our protein, and the fats. We changed that to the healthiest form we could, and that's where we began building the momentum to keep changing our life for the better. Do your research and convince yourself of, what you're eating, of what you're buying, what you're eating, and make sure that your health goals are yours and not someone else's. Otherwise, it'll never stick. So make sure you're convinced that this is something that works for you, and I believe you can have a lasting change. If it's in your operation, whether you're a rancher, a farmer, a gardener, make sure that these soil health principles are something you can incorporate. Maybe you can incorporate one of them. Just focus on armor on the soil surface. And that might mean lots of residue or whatever. It might mean living root in the soil as long as possible. Start there, limiting tillage in your garden or in your fields. And I hope that helps in some way. You just start. You get the ball rolling, and then you start seeing those 5 tenets of soil health can be integrated maybe a little easier. So you start incorporating more and more of them. And eventually, maybe you love cash crops and you don't want anything to do with livestock. Talk to a neighbor, and maybe they'll bring on their herd onto your land and you can custom graze or something like that. Work with those around you, and maybe someone has chickens and you want livestock on your acres. See if they'll bring some chickens and you guys can work together to do something there. But whether you're somebody in the city that has no desire to do any farming or ranching, but you believe in regenerative agriculture, get to know those that are doing it and start buying from them and start learning from them. Maybe you could start working with them or working for them and just kind of spread the word. That's where it kind of begins. But the regenerative movement is alive and well. It is really growing quickly, and there's lots and lots of documentaries out there. There's a lot of info online. I would go to Understanding Ag. They teach about it. YouTube has so many amazing videos, and I just think I would start there and see where it goes for you. So that's how we transition our operation. I'm sure I missed some things, but that's kind of the gist of where we're headed. Cutting out seed treatments, eliminating as much chemical as possible, cutting back on all fertility, more and more to where we don't have to use synthetic nutrients. And I just think that is where we're at right now, and the desire that we have to get away from all that is a work in progress, and that's what we're moving towards. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening, and have a blessed rest of your week. Well, that wraps up another episode of Outta the Cage. Thanks for sticking around. I hope this episode has opened your eyes to the world of possibilities that are in store for you when you begin seeing things differently. If you enjoyed what you heard today, would you mind running over to your favorite podcast platform and subscribe, and also rate us so that we can impact more people? If you think of someone that could benefit from listening to this episode, please share it with them. You can also check out the website at outofthecagepodcast.com. There you will see all of our episodes as well as sign up for my newsletter. I'm looking forward to next time. Until then, stay curious and keep pressing ahead.